You for the course HIST 705 Local History Research. My name is Ron Shaw, and I'm here with Mr. Duncan Merritt to discuss his time at Virginia Polytechnic Institute, or more commonly what's known today as Virginia Tech. He attended there from 1964 to 1968. Thank you, Duncan, for participating in this oral history interview.
You're welcome. Happy to be here.
So why don't we start? You can just give us a broad overview of what your time was at Virginia Tech, and did the war have any effect on your 4 years at the school?
Right, as you said, Virginia Tech today is very much changed from the Virginia Polytechnic Institute, or VPI. When I attended it, it was at that time in a unique position of one of four military colleges, I guess you'd say, VMI, the Citadel, Texas A&M, and Virginia Polytechnic Institute, where there was very strong influence and indeed a prevalence, because at one point it was required that you come into the Corps of Cadets. We were just emerging from that when I arrived there, so it still had a strong influence on the campus. In addition, this is not a liberal arts college. It's kind of the A&M university, mostly mechanical at that time, an engineering school. The agriculture was not as big, and very much a Southern influence, shall we say. Kind of ironic that the part of the country that wanted to secede from the Union in the Civil War ended up being a place where patriotism and love of country was stronger. It's kind of ironic, isn't it? Once again, reflecting on this discussion, I hadn't really thought about it before, but I don't remember any discussions or apprehension about policy to the war. Certainly individuals knew that they were on borrowed time. They were there because of the idea that when you're in college, you're not going to be drafted, that you're in abeyance, but at some point that would come up. But the range of discussions that people talked about did not include running to Canada or other options. If the number came up, they would serve. And certainly it was part of my decision to be in the Corps of Cadets, to be in ROTC, that if I was going to be drafted anyway, that this would be a better option. And if the war hadn't been going on, I wouldn't have been in the Corps of Cadets, I don't think. So anyway, long answer to a short question.
Well, you started at Virginia Tech in the fall of 1964, correct?
That's right, yeah.
So it was really less than a year after President Kennedy had been assassinated,
right.
And just after the August 1964 Gulf of Tonkin incident, which is what President Johnson then later used for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution and really to launch U.S. involvement in the war. Overall support for the U.S. military action was fairly strong at that time. I don't think many people realize it was up around 70% prior to some of the big search and destroy missions in the mid-60s. So understanding, like you said, that Southern Virginia is a fairly traditional region. Was there any apprehension at all as this was ramping up? Like, did anybody, like you talked about the draft a little bit, but the draft was continuing since World War II and would be until 1973. Was it a topic of conversation on campus that the U.S. was sliding toward this war in 1965, late 65? You had the Ya Drang campaign, which was really the first time U.S. had some major casualties, and then 66, you had operations in South Vietnam that produced casualties. Was this a topic of discussion at all on campus?
Not that I remember. Of course, I was somewhat isolated because I ran track, so all seasons, cross country, spring track, and indoor track in the winter. So I was just involved with surviving, going to class, going to practice, getting dinner, trying to do some homework before I fell asleep. So we were somewhat remote. I was in the athletic dorm. So I was somewhat remote, even from the Corps of Cadets, because the Corps of Cadets, they were in a different place. We had our own unit within the athletic dorm. So I was somewhat removed from the military community as well as from the general population in terms of those kind of discussions. Maybe if I'd had more free time, I might have got into those discussions, but I don't remember that being prevalent at the time. So
were students worried that if they dropped out of school, they would be subject to the draft? Did that come up?
Absolutely. Yeah, certainly. The draft was there. As you say, I didn't realize it'd been going on since World War II, but it because of Vietnam, it was the likelihood of being drafted was much higher. And there's no doubt about the fact that was a dangerous place to be. So I'm sure it was on people's minds. And once again, I don't remember much of a discussion, but certainly I had to go through the logic of, okay, what do I want to do? And that's where I came up with the decision to to join the ROTC, which I would not otherwise have done, I don't think.
So by your senior year, which was 1968, the Vietnam War had a much higher profile. This is at the point where President Johnson was struggling and actually eventually announced that he was not going to run for office again in the fall. The Tet Offensive had kicked off in January, and that lingered through the entire year of 1968, really. And Walter Cronkite made his famous proclamation on the evening news where he, to paraphrase, he said, "This war is not winnable. Let's get out with honor." Many have cited that this early 1968 was just a pivotal time in the war and in the country, and it changed the public image of the war, that public support was failing. Was any of this evidenced in and around Blacksburg, or was it still somewhat shielded by its location and the Southern culture that it existed in?
Yeah, I don't remember any change in attitude. I mean, as I say, there was an awareness of the Vietnam War. There was an awareness that that was something that all students would be confronted with when they graduated or when they left. If you leave, then you lose it under any circumstances. So, but I don't remember any intensity other than just the personal consequences of that situation. I don't remember discussions about overall, problems with the policy, with protests, even as the nation's attitude may have been moving from, as you say, from full support to, pretty large scale negative opinions about what was going on in Vietnam.
And in discussing this earlier with you, you had sent me a history article that mentioned that I think it was Williams Hall at Virginia Tech was occupied by protesters, and the state police came in and arrested them. And it's interesting, that contrast then. By 1970, it seems things did change to some extent, but I know it's hard to discuss something that happened 2 years after you left school. You're already in the Air Force. You're probably finishing your tour, getting ready to head to Southeast Asia yourself. But does it surprise you that happened in 1970, judging by your experience in 1968?
I reflected on that a little bit. I'd have to say, at the outset, yes, it surprises me because I didn't see any evidence of it 2 years before. But at the same time, as I was leaving, there were a lot of cultural things going on. As I say, we were evolving from a military school. All of a sudden, you had, what shall I say, the large civilian population getting larger and larger, fewer and fewer people choosing to be in the Corps of Cadets. And we had women coming in. That was fairly small, but getting larger. It's now totally coeducational. Culturally, the thing that I remember, based on the question, was all of a sudden, when I left shortly thereafter, we had coeducational dorms. We had men and women in the same dorm. As I remember it, sharing bathrooms and showers and the whole thing. Maybe I'm exaggerating it. So it wasn't just Vietnam. There was the whole cultural shift that was going on that um, that was a part of perhaps the kinds of things that happened in 1970, which, reading that article, it sounds like it was a fairly small group that made the news, because that's then and today what makes the news is whatever looks, even if it's a very small group, you're trying to, bring alarm or bring a controversy into your news stories. So in reflecting on it, I guess it doesn't surprise me as much, because there was so many societal changes that were going on, finally made their way down to Southwest Virginia, that this, I guess, would be in line with the other things I was seeing.
Yeah, that's a great point, that society was going through quite a transformation in the late 60s, and it eventually is going to find its way in, but it's just a fascinating point, I guess, from our viewpoint in the 21st century, where communications are instantaneous. It's a 24-hour news cycle,
Yep.
that we seem to judge the past sometimes in that light. And it's interesting to look back on that and say, well, no, that's not really how it was. Things were changing, but they weren't changing in the perspective that we see it today.
Yeah.
So, well, thank you very much for joining me and discussing this topic. I appreciate your candidness and looking at this interesting time in American history.
Well, thank you. It's been good to reflect back and try to figure out if my memory's failing, or if what I'm remembering really was what was happening. I'm not sure what the answer is, but I did my best to try and bring to bear what was really going on.
Great. We appreciate your service at Liberty and the experience in those times. Thanks again.
Okay. Thank you, Rod. Bye.